We're here to talk about something that I guess is, let me ask you this. Why is this a topic? And I know you've been writing about this for years, but why this notion of tribal epistemology? In fact, also define that for us. But why is this topic so important to you? I mean, I know it's related, obviously, to your climate work.
Sure. Well, what I mean by tribal epistemology is just this phenomenon of people evaluating information, not based on whether it's true as we think of true, like corresponding to some larger understanding of the world, but just whether it's good for your team or not, or whether it's echoed by leaders on your team or not. And so it's a phenomenon that everybody's, it's a fancy term, but it's a phenomenon that I think everybody's familiar with these days because you see it playing out on the internet all around you. Everybody's sort of constructing their own realities that support what they already think, picking and choosing the news that they heed. I've been fascinated with it for a long time. I mean, mainly because I think this sort of asymmetry between the left and the right on this particular point is probably the most important phenomenon for understanding American politics today. And I feel like I feel like people dance around it. I feel like people don't really address, especially in the mainstream media, I feel like people don't really grapple with it, honestly. So I just wanted to lay it out as sort of clearly and completely as possible. And of course, like in my own area, I cover climate change. So the right wing's sort of insularity and denial of reality, in a lot of ways, was climate was kind of the test run, for a lot of these sort of wacky, epistemic closure that they're suffering. Climate was kind of the canary in the coal mine for that stuff.
It's funny because your piece is entitled "Donald Trump and the Rise of Tribal Epistemology." I think the only thing I would correct with the piece is just I would change "rise" to "victory."
Yes, final victory. That's better. It's been going on for a long time.
Well, I mean it's interesting about the climate though, because you can track. Because you start your piece with Limbaugh and the so-called climate gate, but we know Limbaugh back in the early '90s, and he started, I guess, in '88 in this version of his show. He was the OG Fostergate and Travelgate guy. Like
Sure.
He was the one who was talking about Vince Foster, go in the park, getting his body dragged to the park, and
yep.
But I guess climate was the first thing that broke out in such a, because there was always some of this filtering in from the right, but the climate was the first one where the tentacles wrapped itself around the entire conservative brain, wasn't it?
Yeah, and on a large, wide-ranging issue too. Like there's plenty of sort of individual craziness that you can trace before them, but this is sort of like, I guess climate is where it became really naked and obvious, right? Like the sort of contrast between the clear consensus of the world's scientists and the conservative movement just became so clear so quickly. And in normal circumstances, when you clarify to someone that the overwhelming consensus of scientists disagrees with them, they're obliged to change their mind, right? Like that's how we think it works. That's how we think of science. Like science is, we whatever our political disagreements, ultimately in the end we defer to the best scientific knowledge. That's how we naively think of it. So this was, an example of the conservatives just saying, yes, we see your consensus of the world's scientists, and we don't care. Screw you. We still don't believe it. So it's just kind of it's a very glaring example. It's hard. There's no way to talk your way around it.
It just occurs to me that in one of the things, back in the Air America days, Stephen Sherrill and I had written a book that was, a more sort of, supposed to be funny, and I think it was sort of funny, but it was, we were talking about how those on the right on the margins were taking over the party apparatus. And I remember, I think it was a quote from Gertrude Himmelfarb, who's Bill Kristol's mom, I think, who was talking about attacking science as a way of decoupling people from the ability to have arguments that can be resolved by a sort of a neutral arbiter in some fashion.
They attack neutral arbiters. I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to do at the piece, is we have these sort of like examples here and there of they attack this neutral arbiter and they attack this neutral arbiter, and I talked about Newt Gingrich back in 1995 shutting down the Office of Technology and Assessment in the Congress, which was just meant to be a neutral arbiter of information for Congress people, to give them non-biased information. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the piece is sort of draw all those together and say it's no coincidence that this movement is going after one neutral arbiter after another. It's the nature of this movement to be hostile to neutral arbiters as such. Like, that's one of the things I wanted to do, is kind of show that this is a pattern. It's not just individual judgments.
And they're attacking a structure first, and the what those structures are presenting is secondary, right? I mean, because presumably that technology office and the CBO presumably comes up with numbers that are favorable to a conservative argument in one time or another, but better to get rid of it a whole cloth.
Yes, I think their instinct is to see things as us versus them, right? Our tribe versus their tribe. And so this idea that there could be this third party, this referee above this disagreement, sort of making calls on it, judging one side or the other as having violated some rule, that is offensive to them. I think when they see something that looks like that, I think their instinct is just to think this is just the other team in disguise, right? They're pretending to be referees here. They're pretending that science is unbiased. They're pretending that media is unbiased, whatever. But really, it's just the left in disguise. It's the left trying to win its battle through other means, right? They're just sort of like, I don't think, they're suspicious of the notion of neutral arbiters, but I almost think it's deeper than that. I almost think they just don't believe in them. They don't believe in the possibility of them. So when they see someone pretending to be one, like, for instance, a journalist a journalist claiming to be neutral and unbiased, they're just immediately suspicious. They're just immediately like, what bias is he hiding, right? That's where their mind goes.
And I think there's also a question as to, in my experience in dealing with some of these people, and I'm thinking about someone we've had on this program, we haven't talked about in a long time, but so-called Indie Mike, who is a complete independent. He doesn't care. He just listens to facts from both sides. He'll listen to Ann Coulter and to Brett Baer, both of them, and there's a truth in the middle. But his big contention, and I hear this, is that like there's no facts. You have a fact. It's not really a fact. There's no facts.
Right. Well, this is one of the more hilarious kind of ironies of all this. You remember we lived through the 80s and 90s. You remember the right wing railing against cultural relativism in the academy. This idea that it's all just cultures and there's no one truth, there's no one right way, whatever. They hated that, but now they have created that environment, right? That's what they've created, is this total postmodernism that we're struggling through right now. The thing is, on a philosophical level, I think it's true that we probably can't identify transcendent facts that are independent of any human judgment, et cetera, et cetera. All we have is our best judgment, right? All we have is our best consensus. So that's why we set up society. That's why we gather people together and say, okay, you're going to run an institution, we're going to call it science, you're going to use these procedures, you're going to have certain rules you follow, you're going to examine the knowledge you produce, you're going to have to replicate your experiments, you're going to go through peer review. We set up this institution to gather and vet knowledge so that we can come to the best conclusion we can, right? The best judgment we can. That's what we call a fact, is just something that's been verified by the fact verifiers we've appointed as a society. But if you decide we're not going to trust those fact gatherers and verifiers, we're not going to trust their conclusions, then you are in a situation, right, where there are no facts. If you've rejected the institutions whose job it is to certify what's a fact and what isn't, if you reject them, then you're right. There are no facts. There's my facts and your facts. And that seems to be what they want, because when politics becomes that, it's just a contest of power, right? There's no persuasion. There's no talking with someone. If you don't share a bedrock of factual information, you can't even have a coherent argument. So it just becomes a power struggle.
Well, and I also think, though, that the scenario that you're creating, my facts and your facts, right? That there is no society doesn't come together to create institutions that provide some type of neutral arbitration. That to me seems very consistent with a vaguely libertarian worldview, right? I mean, I've spoke to libertarians who are like, well, we don't really need courts. You would have a court, I would have a court, and they would adjudicate, and we don't need to have, government regulation. We can have private entities that provide a seal of approval on, this doctor is approved by Moody's, right? They get a AAA rating.
Yeah,
like the whole idea is that you can
Yelp ratings.
It is literally to them a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah,
and literally, like you pay for the ideas, and if I support them, they win.
Well, I think one interesting thing that's happening as Trump sort of openly assaults American institutions and norms is that a lot of people, and I include people on the right and on the left in this, are rediscovering a kind of small c conservative fondness or respect for these basic institutions and norms of American life, right? So you're seeing tensions within the right between the people who are leaning in the kind of Trump burn it all down direction and people who are like, you know what, like it's nice having courts that both sides respect. It's nice having scientific fact that both sides respect. It seems to enable a society to go on, and it's happening on the left too. It's sort of you see all these new subscriptions to the Washington Post and
New York
the New York Times. And I was talking with someone in the EPA the other day, and she's like, most of my career has been people yelling at me, but for the last few months, I get people coming up to me and just thanking me spontaneously and hugging me. I feel like there's a recognition happening on both sides that these institutions and norms that we spent decades, in some case centuries, building up are worth defending. It's not, burn it all down as a casual sentiment is one thing, but when you start seeing the things that hold us together as a society fraying, you're like, start to have a little bit more respect for those things.
Well, that is from the sort of old school blogger days in the early aughts. That was the difference between the sort of left blogosphere and right blogosphere media critiques, right? Which is the left would critique the New York Times and the Washington Post as being with an aim to reforming it, whereas the right would be like, we're going to, make these people toxic. I mean, this is right. I mean, it's just the difference is that now, like one of those war bloggers, essentially, for lack of a better term, is now the president of the United States.
I don't even know if you could say the war blogger is the president so much as you're sort of like average war blogger reader is president.
Yes,
now.
Commenter, the guy who
exactly.
they still tolerate.
Well, I mean, I think there's really something to that. I mean, I think originally this incredibly long piece I wrote was even incredibly longer, but at one point I had a section there about, sometimes people are talking about, Trump's populism and Sanders' populism, have these sort of some themes in common. Maybe there's like common cause to be made between these two between these two groups, and there's a populist movement to be had. And what I was saying is that hope is forlorn because Sanders populists do critique our institutions and norms with an eye toward reform, with an eye towards strengthening them and making them fairer and better, making them take more account of the perspective of poor and marginalized people, because I think Sanders' left populists recognize that the weak and vulnerable are the ones who benefit from having these structures and institutions in place. They restrain the powerful. But whereas Trump's populists, I think, come from a more, burn it down perspective. They don't want to reform or heal these institutions. They want to burn them down. They don't like the direction that American democracy has taken for the last, century. They want to start over. So I think those are just that's a fundamental difference between right populism and left populism that makes any sort of hope of alliance forlorn.
Along those lines, you cite studies by Will Wilkinson of the Niskanen, I think it is, Institute.
Niskanen.
Niskanen.
I had to ask.
Niskanen. I mean, I've been mispronouncing that guy's name for, I think, probably a decade. But he was a former head of the Cato Institute, but famously said the problem with cutting taxes the way that we did during the Reagan administration is it actually encourages more spending because you're putting it on a credit card, essentially. I think he said somewhere like around 15% of GDP. But nevertheless, longtime listeners will know I was sort of obsessed with that guy for a while.